Richard completed Volume 2 of his historical study, subtitled The Cover-Up Exposed, 1973 to 1991, and is now at work on the final volume of his historical trilogy. Richard has also published articles and spoken at conferences around the world. Among his main themes are the destruction of our political liberties as a result of the UFO cover-up. He has also speculated on the possibility of nature of non-humans themselves and their presence here means for our civilization. This has led him to make a fresh approach to the topic of exopolitics and to develop unique insights into practical challenges and opportunities for the true disclosure of the UFO phenomenon. Richard has done a great deal of television work, having appeared on many documentaries for the History Channel, Sci-Fi Channel, BBC, and elsewhere. In 2006, he has hosted a 6-episode series for the Sci-Fi Channel called The Sci-Fi Investigates. Richard Dolan lives in Rochester, New York, with Karen and their 2 children. Please help me welcome Mr. Richard Dolan.
Ryan, thank you very much. And yes, I've been at 5 crash retrieval conferences in a row now. Very honored and happy to be able to do that. Every year at this conference is a treat for me. On the one hand, I get to meet so many fabulous, brilliant people, speakers and attendees alike, and I'm sure every speaker can agree with me when I say we probably learn more from the other people who are here than we are able to give ourselves. That's certainly true with me, I feel. The other good thing about conferences for me is that they really force me to think through my own ideas about a whole range of things. On Friday, I truthfully said that I ended up redoing my presentation on the plane. I think this is 3 or 4 times in a row. It's my tradition now, I guess. And I guess it's simply because I am a perfectionist about what I want to present, and I want it to be perfect, and I keep rethinking it. So today, my theme is twofold. I want to talk a little bit about my new book. It's been, 5 years in the making. Well, more than that, but about 5 solid years of work, and I'm happy that it's finished. I'm sorry that I have sold out. I brought what I thought would be more than enough, and they were almost all gone Friday night, a few left on Saturday morning, and that was that. They are on my website. You can go get them. I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to talk a little bit about the future. So a little bit looking back and a little bit looking ahead. My new book is UFOs and the National Security State, subtitled The Cover-Up Exposed. It covers 1973 to the end of the Cold War, 1991. For many years, I thought that I would just do the whole subsequent last 35 years in one volume. I thought I would cover from 1973 to the present day. And for most of the time that I wrote this book, I was working under that assumption. And it just kept, the work just never stopped. And people kept saying, well, when is that book of yours coming out? Well, one of the big reasons was that I was really trying to do too much. A few people, 1 or 2 people here, strongly encouraged me to break it into 3, and I'm very, very grateful for that encouragement. Believe me, it had to be done. The Cover-Up Exposed covers almost 20 years, and it's a 600-page book with a lot of information in there. I published that book myself, and I desktop published that book myself. I'm very proud of that book and the way it looks. The index was all mine. It was over 1,000 index entries. I wanted to make a book that was really reliable for a researcher or a new person alike. And for me, what makes any new bit of research really valuable is to make it easy for people to access. So there's lots to study in the index. A lot of well over 1,000 direct citations. You can see exactly how I put this together. And the book is essentially woven together with roughly 200 or 220 article-length sections that are in it. And you can actually read them on their own. You can just dive into whatever you're interested in reading, but they all really work, as I think, building on each other. If you're interested in reading more about it, my website is keyholepublishing.com. My goal in writing this book, my goal always has been to provide as reliable a guide to our past as I'm able to do. That doesn't make my work unique, but it does characterize how I approach this. The sources that I use are, I think, that the same kind of open sources that any responsible researcher would want to use. I use as many government documents as I can. Journals, professional journals, in our case being the results of investigations by UFO organizations, the MUFON UFO Journal, the IUR, the APRO Bulletin, and Flying Saucer Review, and a host of really lesser-known journals that I was very lucky to get hold of, that were given to me as gifts from various people. Lots of books. Did a lot of interviews for this book. When I wrote my first book years ago, I didn't know anybody. And so it was not the easiest thing to get interviews, or I didn't go through that process. I went through this process many times. I probably interviewed 30 or so people who were direct participants in the events of this book, and that helped a lot. My goal always is to, this is a field, anyone who's studied this a little bit or a lot knows that it's like going into the ocean. And if you stand out at the shore a few feet, you're in shallow waters, but it's safe there. And then you go out a little further, and the currents, you start feeling those currents moving you. You gotta be a little more careful. Then you can start swimming out deep. Now, all of those places are important to be. The problem with going into the deep areas, of course, is that you lose your footing sometimes. You might sink. The shallow area is safe. But of course, we really have to go everywhere, don't we? And what I have tried to do is to be as solid in my presentation of the data as I can be, but also not being afraid to go into the deep areas when I need to. So what I'm saying is that just about every single fact in that book is something that can be easily verified. There are a couple of instances in this book where it's not verified, and I try to make that very clear when I do so. I have three basic themes to this book. First, you could say the encounters themselves, in a sense almost an encyclopedia of all the UFO stuff of that period. If you're interested in a particular event, the Travis Walton abduction case, or the Rendlesham case, the entry of Bob Lazar into the field, or any number of others, Gulf Breeze. My goal was to just write about that in as clear and complete a way as I could, and concise. The emphasis, when possible, would be on military encounters. That's always the thing that interests me the most, but it isn't exclusively that, not by any means. And nor is it exclusively American-based, not at all. It's much more even than the first volume. It's globally based. In large part, that's just where the data is. 1940s, 1950s, most of the good data was American. That's not so when you get into the 1970s and 80s and beyond. A lot of great data is from around the world, and that's where it is. That's where I go. One thing that you find with these encounters is the sheer volume of them, but I'll get to that in a moment. Another major theme, I guess we could call it ufology itself, or our own intellectual history. Long before I got into ufology, my area of study in history, for at least a while, was what we'd call intellectual history, the history of ideas. And that has always been really one of the key interests in my life. How do we perceive ourselves? How have we perceived our history over the years? And in ufology, it's one of these things where I think mainstream society has no idea about how important ufology itself is as a discipline. And think about it. It's our attempt to understand the greatest mystery of our civilization, of our time. How can that not be important? And our response then to understanding that is something that I really wanted to characterize as best I could. So how that research evolved, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. UFO research was in one particular place in the early 70s, and it was in a very different place by 1991, and the story of how it got from the one place to another is an incredible story. I really don't think it's been told the way that I told it. And it was one of my main motivations in writing this book. Part of that story is the attempt to end UFO secrecy, but it's not the only part of that story. It's one that interests me, and it's very much in there. And then the third major theme, I guess we could say, we can call the politics, roughly speaking. How the government agencies, military agencies responded to UFOs, to the extent we can follow that. The whole story about military technology, you know, the ours and theirs question is something that's very important to all of this, and I certainly tried to spend a lot of time on that. You know, what was the status of military cutting-edge technology that we know of in, say, 1975 or 1980 or 1985? I certainly tried to deal with that. And then what was the status of the probable or possible status of black world technology that we may not know about in those periods of time? There's no way that anyone here can definitively provide an answer to these questions, but it's important even to frame the question so that down the road, I certainly hope that other researchers will continue to follow on these questions and maybe answer them better than I have. And then the other political theme, I guess we could say, the broad geopolitics, in a sense, asking the question, who's in charge? Is it the president or some other guy, some other group? And then the vast changes in our world that took place in the 70s and 80s, which really dramatically transformed the nature, not just of ufology itself, but of, well, of our entire world, just went through a major revolution. I wanted to, and I did discuss that a little bit. That's the table of contents of the book. I had some nifty titles in there. I think my favorite was The Empire Strikes Back in chapter 4. That was the year that the movie The Empire Strikes Back came back, and I think came out. I think it's kind of fun. So let me just go through the major themes, and then I think that I will have enough time to get into everything that I want to do today. The encounters are, again, everyone here in this room is probably aware of just how vast, how densely packed the encounters really are. It's really a fact that you could put a big grand map of the last 50 years on a wall and throw a dart at that massive calendar. And I guarantee you, wherever that dart lands on that day, if you were to pull out all of the UFO events that probably occurred on that day, and had they been publicized and properly investigated, they would probably make headline news. It's a remarkable thing. If you go to the National UFO Reporting Center today on the web, Peter Davenport, he posts about, I think, 4,000 sightings a year. They're not all investigated. Most are not investigated, but people are seeing things. And I don't think that that's really ever changed. I think that we have more and more ability to report these things. And so we have just incredible density of sightings. And I can certainly, speaking for myself, my own life, when I meet people privately who discover that I research UFOs, I've spoken to hundreds of people in my city of Rochester, New York, who say, oh, well, I have to tell you what I saw 5 years ago or 10 or 20 years ago. I don't ask for these stories. They just volunteer them. And they often proceed to tell me this is an incredible thing. It's astonishing. I had a local celebrity, famous, locally famous athlete, who told me, I put it in the book, it's 1980. You can read about it. Outside the city of Syracuse, in late afternoon, he sees this football field-sized disc. He said it was like right out of a Steven Spielberg movie. He was with a person, they saw it together. He saw a couple of jets try to intercept it, and the object, this huge thing, just went gone, like that. And, you know, it's another story, it's anecdotal, but I'll tell you this, if you were sitting listening to this man tell the story, I bet you would find him compelling, and you'd find him believable. There's so many of these. It's like, you know, like in the movie The Matrix, where you've got this artificially imposed reality. I'm convinced that that is, in fact, what we do live in. It's not an artificially imposed reality by some advanced AI yet, hopefully not, but rather it's whenever you turn on your TV, you listen to your corporate radio, because that's the matrix. And why? Because that reality doesn't include what we do. And yet what we, I'm sure there are a large number of people here who have directly experienced a UFO type of event. And in all likelihood, you probably haven't told many people. So in other words, there's this immense reality out there. And it gets, even today, when there's a lot more UFO information in the news, even today, I really believe it's absolutely nothing compared with the reality that we experience. So I got a little off track there. The encounters that I've included in this book are just a vast number, and I had to be careful not to overdo it. I mean, how many of these can you just, over and over and over again? Okay, you made your point, Rich. That's really how I felt after a while. They were important because of the reactions that we can tell that many responsible agencies gave them, i.e. serious responses. And we know this because we've got enough documentation to prove this. And then I wrote here the paradigm-shattering nature of these events, and that's absolutely the case, of course, because these objects, these things, these events are not supposed to happen in our reality. And the fact that they do means a great deal, and I'll be exploring that. What I'm going to do now is really just quickly go through a couple of neat aspects or more interesting aspects of what I've tried to cover in this book. The year 1974, I'm convinced, is a forgotten year in how important it really was. It was a big year. And we think of the history of ufology or of UFO encounters. We don't usually think of 1974, but a lot happened. There are two either crashes or downed objects that appear to have happened. Both the researchers who investigate those are here today, Nick Redfern and Linda Moulton Howe. The one that Nick wrote about in his excellent early book, A Covert Agenda, he described what seems to have been a UFO crash in Wales in 1974 in January. Nick wrote about this at great length in his book. I encapsulated it in my own. Basically, a bright object is seen moving, maybe maneuvering, maybe streaking across the sky. Big impact, boom, registered miles away, shattering windows miles away. RAF investigates, police investigate. Some witnesses saw a disc-shaped object in connection with this. One saw a crashed UFO guarded by military, excuse me, and one spoke with Nick about having seen alien bodies in connection to that, and there's a lot there. It's a very interesting case. The other one was Linda Moulton Howe had to remind me of this. It nearly slipped through. Thank you, Linda. I know you're here. I think I saw you. There you are. I'm very grateful. This may have been a crash, may not have been a crash. It seems like it might have been a landing. In New Mexico, near the Sandia Mountains, this number of witnesses. This was investigated briefly at the time by NICAP. They reported it. It didn't really do much with it. Linda did many years later, in 2008, I think was when she did a lot of this. Talked to two people who saw this event. Apparently we had a disc, a silver white disc on the ground, seen by witnesses from a distance through binoculars. Military people there, triangular shaped craft which had runic type lettering on it. Those witnesses said they were, well, one witness spoke about this and said that he and his friends were detained at Kirtland about this and told, you saw a Soviet incident. And again, there's more to that. A recovery of some sort, a operated UFO of some sort. There's a lot we don't know about this, but it certainly indicates the likelihood that we are recovering these objects, and it's more than just Roswell, obviously. A lot more happened in 1974. There's a big wave of UFOs in Spain, documented by Spanish newspapers and U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. A lot there. There's a very interesting statement by the then Minister of Defense of France, Robert Goulet. You don't get this every day from a minister of defense, an acting one. He gave a radio interview in early 1974 talking about how the French gendarmerie was interested in UFOs since 1954. Of course, if you know your history, that was a big year for UFOs in France. He said, you know, we're baffled by many of these events. Talked about radar visual events. He said, if your listeners could see for themselves the massive reports coming in, then they would see that it is all pretty disturbing. Could you imagine an acting U.S. Defense Secretary saying this? That interview, by the way, was made by a French radio station, and that station was broken into. The tapes were taken out. It was all very interesting. Now, contrast that with Governor Ronald Reagan, governor of California at that time. Ronald Reagan saw a UFO in 1974. He saw it in the summer of '74, in July. He was flying in a Cessna. He had a pilot named Bull Painter. They were doing campaign work, I believe. And they're out there, it's a nice day, and they see, excuse me, Reagan's with his two aides and then the pilot. 4 of them are in this Cessna, and they see this white object zigzagging in the sky. And Reagan, you gotta love this, he says, let's go after it. So they try to go after it. You know, they have no success, obviously. It goes straight up into the sky, and it's gone. Well, the interesting thing about that, and when you contrast it with the statement of Robert Goulet, Reagan got really worked up over this event. And about a week later, he was speaking with a journalist named Jonathan Miller, major mainstream journal, and they're sitting next to each other on an airplane. And Reagan is still amped up over his sighting, and he starts talking about it. Yeah, I saw this, it was amazing, and this and that. And Miller looks at him. And as Miller told this later to 2 biographers, they did a study of Reagan in 1988, at the end of his presidency. This was included in a footnote of that. The book was called Landslide. It's not a UFO book, it's a political analysis, that's all. But this UFO story is stuck in the index. Anyway, Miller said, yeah, I'm talking with Reagan about this, and I think he realized the import of what was happening. He's talking to a professional journalist about a UFO sighting. And then he stopped because, Miller had said, sir, are you telling me that you believe in UFOs? That's what it was. And Reagan stopped, collected himself, and realized, I'm talking to a journalist, and this could get out. So he backed away. He said, well, I don't know what it was, but it sure was interesting. And that was that. But here's the difference between Goulet and Reagan. Reagan was not willing to talk about it. Of course, he knew he had a political future, and he didn't want to damage it. And that story came out, 14 or so years later. And it still is really not widely known. When I started hearing this story, it had been passed around. I really couldn't find an attribution for it, and I was happy to find it. 1975, things get really, really intense. And I think that year is rightly understood as one of the most important years in all of the history of the UFO phenomenon. And look, there's just too much to go over, but what we can say is that all across the northern U.S. border, going into Canada, I mean, there were events everywhere, but along there we had, of course, a series of airspace violations that, to this day, defy explanation conventionally. All right, you had objects coming into areas where we had nuclear weapons stored, hovering low, 200-300 feet above, just staying there, triggering alarms, security police, sirens, lights flashing around to investigate this. That was at Loring Air Force Base, and that happened all the way across the U.S. border. Over at Malmstrom Air Force Base, on 2 nights in a row, F-106s tried to intercept lights that were being tracked by NORAD and seen by ground personnel simultaneously. When the jet fighters came into the area, the lights just blinked out. playing a little cat and mouse game. When the jets left the area, the lights returned. There was an amazing chase of an object outside Wurtsmith Air Force Base. And on and on and on. Now, these had been written about before, most famously in the very excellent book Clear Intent, which came out in the 80s by Barry Greenwood and Lawrence Fawcett. I'm not trying to knock that book at all. It's a fine book, but I was never happy with a lot of the organization and the telling of the story. So I tried to tell the story the way I felt it should be told, so you can go take a look. Of course, another famous encounter in Iran. About a year or so ago, George Norrie asked me on the radio, "Richard, what's the best UFO story that you know of? The best?" And caught me a little off guard, but I offered this case here, and I think that it might be for the reason, not that it's really the most dramatic, it isn't, but it might be the best in the sense that it is very dramatic. It's very well documented. The documentation on the Iranian case is absolutely outstanding. Of course, what happened, I think many of you know, in September of 1976, Iran still an ally of the United States, the days of the Shah. Residents of Tehran look up and they see this bizarre light. They call the airport. The airport guy says, sure. Eventually, he goes to take a look, and he sees it too. He calls the Air Force, and they send, in succession, 2 F-4 fighters to investigate. And in both cases, when they got to a range of about 25 miles from this object, both the pilots are seeing it visually, they're getting it on their airborne, and in one case, a pilot was about to fire a missile. His systems go offline. And in the other case, also, the pilot's electronic communications key systems were somehow disabled at a distance of 25 miles. In one of those cases, the object detached a smaller object. And by the way, this object had a very large radar return. It detaches a smaller object. Meanwhile, the F-4 pilot is doing this emergency pulling away. This object comes up and turns inside his own arc before it rejoins the original object. This is all in the Defense Intelligence Agency memo, a memo which went to the President of the United States. It went to Henry Kissinger. It went everywhere. A heck of a case. When you talk to these skeptical scientists who say there's no evidence of UFOs as being anything extraordinary, it's obvious they haven't done their homework. They just shoot their mouths off thinking that they know what they're talking about. It's the easiest thing to do. The easiest thing to do is to say UFOs are impossible because the distances between the stars are too distant. Don't you people understand that? You know, and they try to make you feel like an idiot. Well, that's great. Start reading some of these reports and then tell me how it's impossible. I don't really know all of how the physics are overcome. Probably very few people do it. We can guess, okay. But the fact is, what we know is that we have these events. There's all kinds of reasons why UFOs are impossible. That's easy. The problem is that they're still here. And these you know, blowhard, arrogant, windbag scientists think they know what they're talking about. Yes. And they obviously have done no homework. I laugh, but you know, it's funny, but it's also tragic. The other thing about this case, and this is very thanks to Ron Regehr that I can say this. Ron is here, and he's expert on the DSP, this Defense Support Program satellite system. These are satellites that we have out there, and as Ron has argued, I think very persuasively, they are optimally designed as UFO detection satellites. Well, be that as it may, the DSP satellites detected a fast walker at exactly on the day at the spot of the Iranian encounter, so it's another confirmation. There's a lot to confirm this case. It's a great case. And you know, the thing I want to just leave you with on that, of course, is what is the technology that allows whatever that object was to do what it did? In 1976, an F-4 fighter plane is a great aircraft. And in the 70s, it was near top of the line. And whatever this thing was, disabled both of them in a row. Okay? So if you want to argue that UFOs are an experimental technology deep black technology. Okay, well, fine. I guess we can explore that. But it still begs the question of who's operating them and what are the principles on which these things do their work, and how are they able to be that efficient and that devastating in warfare. And where, by the way, are these in our warfare? They would have come in mighty handy in Afghanistan and Iraq, I should think. But they're not in evidence, are they? Bolivia, we have another probable crash. Well, we have a definite crash of something. Very interesting case. Was this a genuine UFO? Well, my answer is maybe. I would say probably. It seems like it was. I don't think that this was just some kind of satellite. It was a very large object described as egg-shaped, cylindrical, about 14 feet in diameter, pretty big. It was heavy. It made a big impact on the ground when it slammed into these mountains. A lot of investigation by U.S. intelligence. Project Moondust was activated for this. Moondust was a long-standing program to investigate space-based objects that come to Earth. 1980, it just keeps going. I'm going to fly through some of these. It's, you know, the Rendlesham case is listed at the bottom, and of course, we all know about that. There's a lot of other things that happened in 1980 that are just amazing. There was an Austrian jet fighter chase in the spring of that year, and this pilot just says this thing was flying very fast and then very slow. It seemed to be playing with us. Sounds familiar. The UFO was flying 3,000 meters over us, and although we tried all possible maneuvers, we couldn't catch it. In May, for 2 days in a row of 1980, the Peruvian Air Force had just spectacular encounters with whatever this thing was. Round object was hovering near the airfield. Commanders scrambled an Su-22 to intercept it. It was a fighter bomber. The pilot fired a missile at close range with absolutely no damage to this object. The UFO then just outperformed that aircraft in leaving. The next day, the situation was repeated, only this time no missile was fired. Antonio Huneas is here, told me that he looked into this case a lot. He said, well, yeah, actually, I learned that the commander said, you know, those missiles are expensive, and we blew the budget on the first one. I'm not going to do it twice. So he decided not to fire. The Rendlesham case could very well be the single most important case of the modern era. It's one of these cases. It was a tough one for me to write about, in that, as Linda pointed out yesterday, that case has taken years to unfold. It came out in the early 80s, and we knew a certain number of things about it, bare bones history. And then we learned a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then certain things kept changing because people sometimes were protecting each other. And these things were always used by skeptics, of course, against the case. But the fact is that the more we uncover about Rendlesham, the more it gives. There's a major event that happened there, paramount importance. And as the 1980s go, just amazing events, incredible, spectacular things occurring. In the remote village area of Dolan in Norway, there's nothing there. It's a valley with about a couple of thousand people. It was said that if you go there, you could hear a tractor going like miles away, because it's empty, barren, cold. Well, what happened there? These objects started to be seen. Are they light phenomenon? Are they craft? Yes and no. They're a bit of everything. They would stop and maneuver and act intelligently and act, you know, like the Old Norse god Loki. Appropriate, mischievous god who you couldn't really trust this guy. And that's like the phenomenon there. It was playful. Teams would come out with measuring devices, very scientific group of people. And they would get radar sometimes. They would get other types of trackings. But this phenomenon defies all explanation. And the Hess-Dolan phenomenon continues to this day. It's inexplicable, again, in conventional terms. At the same time that Dolan was breaking out as a major event, in a completely opposite area of the world, that is the Hudson Valley region, just north of one of the most populated areas on Earth, New York City, you have thousands and thousands of people reporting objects, again, that are not supposed to exist. Boomerangs, triangles, large craft hovering low, silently over the Taconic Parkway. Traffic stopped, people getting out, jaws dropping, lights coming down from above, intense lights like daylight. And this is reported over and over again. The Hudson Valley case is fascinating for just so many reasons, and one of them is for how the mainstream media handled it. Now, it's not hard to understand this, really. We get frustrated because we're interested in the truth, and we want the truth to come out, but just really imagine that you are a media spokesperson. You're working for the FAA, and you have to talk to the media about the Hudson Valley. I mean, how on earth are you supposed to talk about this without generating panic? And this was a very serious concern at the time. You know, you can't just easily say, there is this unknown phenomenon out there that's immense. We don't know who it is. That's not going to be a very successful way publicly to deal with this problem. And so what did they do? Well, they lied, of course. They managed the media. They managed the New York Times coverage of this. It's very clear. They managed, I think it was NBC or ABC, one of them did a major special on it. And just all whitewashes. And that's the story. That's the name of the game. There were a number of very interesting space-based UFO encounters of the 80s, of course of the 70s and of the 90s as well. In the 80s, there were some good ones. This one here, I've got on the, if you could put that on the screen. There's this little light. This is not my, here we go. This right here. This is a frame from a 1984 space mission, and this object here, okay, I've looked at this myself. I did check it out with Dr. Bruce Maccabee. What happens is that if you look at the frame, the video, this object appears, it comes into view, hold on here, comes into view up here and undulates a little bit. It gets larger. It gets larger as it moves off, as if it's coming toward the camera. And Bruce said, well, you know, it's a legitimate film. It's not a fake. He said, I don't really know what that is, but I'll just tell you my opinion. I look at that, and I don't think that that's a reflection. And you know, you can look for this yourself. To me, I think that that's an anomaly, and I think it's one of many that have been captured over the years. And then, of course, with activity like that, you have to wonder, what is the exact nature of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, promoted by President Ronald Reagan, starting in 1983, promoted in turn by Edward Teller to Ronald Reagan. Conventional histories of SDI, they don't get into any of this connection here, but look, there are anomalous events that have taken place in space. They've happened. And so you have to assume that there's got to be a component of SDI that's related to that. And it would be idiocy not to wonder, and foolish not to think it's likely. I told this story in my book. For years I wouldn't mention it, but this is a true story. This happened to me. In the year 1983, I was 21 years old. I was flying out of the country for the first time to Oxford. I was on a scholarship, and I was standing in the Newark airport in New Jersey. And there were TVs in the airport, not the big plasma ones that we have today, but the little TVs, and the news was on. This was July of 1983, and I remember I was feeling kind of nervous about the flight, and I was just killing time and watching the television, and there was a news report about SDI, which was very much in the news at the time. And I wasn't even really paying attention to it. I was just sort of passively watching it, and then this man walked up to me. He was dressed like I am now. He was a nicely dressed, professional-looking guy. He was I thought, in his 40s. He just stood there, He was looking at that next to me, and I was aware that he was there. It was just the two of us. And when the news story ended, he said to me, "You know what that's about, right?" And I looked at him thinking, "You're crazy." "I don't want to talk to you. I don't know who you are." That's not what I said. I said, "Well, no, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, that's about ETs." And I mean, he literally said that to me. And I'm thinking, crazy man. I didn't say that either. I just said, "Oh, okay. Well, I gotta go." And I walked off. I didn't want to talk to him. That's a true story. And I forgot about that for years. I just put it out of my head until I was writing my first volume. And it just went, my God, oh my God, what a strange thing. I don't know what that means. You know, coincidence, I guess, some guy with an agenda, I don't know. But it happened. It happened. And I do believe it must be considered and more than that, really seen as a really valid hypothesis. And we've got to continue to do more work in investigating that possibility. More events in Brazil and Alaska in 1986 that are, you know, they're classic cases. The Alaskan case is very well known. Yesterday, Michael Schratt talked a little bit about that in his very, very excellent presentation. And the Brazil case is another one. And I think it was in May of '86, Brazilian Air Force was scrambled over an enormous area and tracking a large number of UFOs. This, again, was recorded in a U.S. defense memo. Gulf breeze. You know, the period of the 70s and 80s is filled with just one landmine, minefield after another in ufology, and I dreaded every single one of them. As much as I enjoy doing historical work, I often feel like I just would love to be able to weasel out of researching some of these things, because it's almost a no-win scenario. No matter what you write, you're going to annoy somebody. Somebody won't be happy. Gulf breeze is one of these cases in point. It's a very controversial case. When I went into really digging into it, I mean, for years and years, I just held back in formulating a final opinion. But once I really looked into Gulf breeze, everything that I was able to learn about, and I read pretty much everything I could get my hands on, I believe the Gulf breeze case was absolutely legitimate. I believe that now, and I don't see it being easy to change my mind on this, although I'm always open, but I don't think so. This is one reason why the infamous Gulf breeze model. You talk to people today and they say, "Oh yeah, I heard that model, that's all fake. The guy made a model and got found in his attic." It's an amazing thing. The attack on Ed Walters through the Gulf breeze saga is beyond anything that I can really think about in the recent UFO history. I mean, this man was subject to just non-stop, incessant attempts to destroy him, his credibility. And the Gulf breeze model is the coup de grace. But the baldness of the model itself as a hoax is obvious. That model was planted. And when you look at the details of how that model was found in the home that he no longer lived in, with access that was indeed possible through a certain, through the garage, even after the house was vacated. The way that it was found, the way it was brought to the attention of the media, all of which I have in my book. I really believe that once you look at that account, you will agree. You will see this man was set up. And why was he set up? Well, not simply because of these, these photographs that were beyond photographs that you would find anywhere. I mean, the quality and the quantity of these. But also the fact that Ed Walters continued to say that these beings are communicating with me. I'm getting they're they talk to me somehow on a regular basis. And in the mid and late 80s, this was just not an acceptable thing to say. And what would happen if people started to believe him? Would there be the potential for a kind of a cult? Would he become a kind of a new icon? Would people flock to him? Would it disrupt the society as it was? Did he have to be disabled? Yeah, he had to be disabled. That's my opinion. Now, you can read it and disagree if you like. Let me know. Put it on the forums. There's already people getting all over my case because I don't associate with the right people. Yeah, well, God forbid, I spoke at the Project Camelot conference 2 months ago, and associated with bad people, I guess. You know, let me just say something about that. If someone invites me to speak somewhere and I have an opportunity to say my piece, then I'll go. If I have a chance to say what I think is an important message, then I will go. No one ever changes anything that I have to say, no matter where I am. And so that's all I'll say on that matter. The phenomenon gets very interesting toward the late 1980s as I get to the end of this book. Of course, Area 51, S4, that kind of breaks out. The Groom Lake facility breaks out as a major place. This is a photograph that was taken in early 1990 by a gentleman named Gary Schultz outside Area 51. Looks very much like descriptions of what's now being called the ARV, Alien Reproduction Vehicle, quite possibly. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. The Belgian Triangle, or triangle sightings, there were many in late 89 and into 1990. Some incredible encounters over the Soviet Union. I guess probably the most prominent and most spectacular took place in the spring of 1990 over near Moscow, in which Soviet jets were scrambled to intercept another immense inexplicable object. This is something, you know, during a few years toward the end of the Soviet Union, there was this window of openness. And Soviet generals and defense ministers actually would talk about UFOs. It was an extraordinary period. So we know a bit about this. The real question is, who's making these objects? Well, over at Area 51, you could probably assume, realistically, that we are making that. And that object that Gary Schultz saw and that other people going to Area 51 at that time could see did all kinds of maneuvers that were non-aerodynamic. So I think we can safely presume, and again, I'm going to explore this in a moment, that I'll use that phrase loosely, humanity is building its own version of these objects. The Belgian Triangle, my inclination is to feel that that's also the case. Some people would say, well, yeah, but you know, we're flying our own experimental aircraft over Belgium and not telling the Belgians. Well, yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. Now, of course, at the time, this is when the stealth fighter had just been revealed. And a lot of people said, oh, well, it's probably the stealth fighter. But that's not the stealth fighter. That's something else. But are we making triangular craft? Yes, I think that we have been making triangular craft for some time. Now, having said that, this object that was tracked by Belgian Air Force radar did maneuvers that are amazing. At one point, according to the Belgian Air Force radar, it dropped 4,000 feet in altitude in 1 second. It's nearly a mile. It had incredible variations in its speed, from as slow as 30 miles per hour to over 1,500 miles per hour. Think about that for a minute. So this is an object that, whatever it's using, is extraordinary. So maybe we're not making it, but my suspicion is that we did. So that's a little bit about the encounters, and there's just a great deal more. I'll leave it at that for now. I want to keep moving. Exposing the cover-up. The subtitle of this new book is The Cover-Up Exposed. You'll see why. You know, ufology, as I said earlier, is the story of humanity's response to the greatest mystery, maybe of all time. of our time, without a doubt. It's an important part of our own history, and it went through dramatic changes. So I'll do a quick little review. Here's some photographs of some of the leaders in ufology at that time. On the top, you have James Lorenzen. Where's the? There we go. Richard Hall, recently deceased, over on the right there. Walter Andrus is the only one here who's still alive on this list. Coral Lorenzen and J. Allen Hynek. The story of UFO research in the early 70s was one of a discipline trying to regroup. By the late 60s, the Condon Committee had slapped down ufology. If you remember, the whole issue came to a head, because during the 60s, there were a lot of amazing UFO sightings, and it once again looked, as it has so many times, that this issue would break free. And what happened, of course, is that the Condon Committee, the University of Colorado study, said, no, this is a topic of, there's no probative value. That is, science will not benefit from studying it. Air Force should just drop it. So at that point, UFO research really was in the gutter. And what happened in the 70s is an attempt to regroup. And they did a great job, frankly. What you start hearing about in the 70s is what became called scientific ufology. Now, of course, as anyone really who's done science knows, to do real science, you need money, and there's no money in ufology, okay? But the use of scientific principles, okay, that's something you can always employ, even without a dime. And so this was the attempt. The Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, CUFOS, and APRO. All of these organizations really promoted the idea of scientific ufology. In other words, to reach out to the mainstream scientific community and gain respectability after the Condon Committee debacle. As a result, it was a very politically conservative group of people. There was a survey done in the early and mid-70s of the political views of most UFO researchers, and they were a very conservative group. Most were Republicans politically at that time. Most were not conspiracy theorists in the least. It's very interesting. There was certainly little to no emphasis on the truly bizarre things like abductions or mutilation, things like that. There was a fair amount of creativity, we have to say. People like Jacques Vallée and other people, John Keel, who had a lot of influence, I think, started talking about other possibilities than just simply the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This is all very important. In Europe in particular, you get the development of what we might call the psychosocial school of UFO research. In other words, looking at alternative ways of understanding this that didn't include men from another planet, like the day the Earth stood still or something like that. But you can also say that there was a very an unwillingness to look too much into the cover-up aspects of it until you get to a few years later, the late 70s, and that started to change. Leonard Stringfield, again, someone who's mentioned a few times in lectures yesterday, by the late 70s begins, as a result of his fine book, Situation Red, in which he talked a little bit about the crash retrieval phenomenon, something that had been long discredited among the mainstream UFO research community. Stringfield started to look at it, and as a result, started getting people to come to him. This is also during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. It was really a unique moment in American history when people actually believed, some of them, that there was going to be an announcement on UFOs. I mean, Jimmy Carter had said as a candidate that he had seen a UFO. And I don't believe that Jimmy Carter ever truly planned as president to release this data. But nonetheless, the idea was widespread that he would. And as a result of that, Stringfield began to get not dozens, but scores and scores of first-hand and second-hand accounts of crashed UFOs, sightings of dead alien bodies at secure facilities, and so on. At the same time, the Freedom of Information Act really kicked in. I mean, FOIA had initially been passed in 1966, but it didn't get teeth until '74, and then again by an executive order by Jimmy Carter a couple of years into his presidency. And then what that allowed was for freedom of information to apply to many, many broad areas of public inquiry, including UFOs. Suddenly, thousands and thousands of documents pertaining to UFOs get released by the government. So it's like a two-pronged attack on the citadel. You have the documents and you have the leaks. And really, in other words, the whole secrecy situation was transformed very, very fast. Okay? By the way, oh, can you put that? There's a younger Stanton Friedman over there. It looks a little nerdy. I love him, but it's slightly nerdy. Peter Gersten, on the other hand, always looks like he wanted to be a rock star, even here in the '70s. And there's Leonard Stringfield. All of this resulted, I think, from political developments in the sense that it's really been an observation of mine that political crises will often lead to some openness on the UFO topic. In America in the '70s, we had Watergate, we had the aftermath of Vietnam. A very, very, really, I think, probably the most politically liberal mood of our modern history was in the aftermath of that, and in the Carter administration. So there were political developments that directly affected UFO research. And as I say at the bottom here, potentially serious development, as you can see. All right, really within a few short years, the whole situation had become transformed. As we go into the 1980s, we are leaving the comfort zone, we might say. Bud Hopkins makes his appearance with his book, Missing Time. Starts saying things like, you know, this abduction phenomenon is very widespread. Of course, other researchers were starting to move in that direction. The mutilation phenomenon. I mean, Linda Moulton Howe had been looking at this for some time. The mutes had been occurring, you know, for years, actually. But it was in 1980 when Linda's work really broke through to the mainstream. And things become very intense. Debates were very, very intense. This did not go through easily within ufology. And then the idea of crash retrievals. This is maybe the ultimate of all of the divisive issues. Because it's one thing to argue, as people had done previously, that the government was protecting the public from the reality of UFOs, because they didn't want the public to be frightened and whatever. Okay. But it's a totally different thing to say that the government or the military is hiding their possession of alien technology. Because to do that, okay, takes it vastly, vastly deeper. You know, the first argument allows the government to pretend that it's still ignorant of what's going on. Okay? Well, there's this phenomenon, we don't really know what it is, but we don't want you to panic. The second scenario, the crash retrieval scenario, that's really impossible, obviously. And it necessitates, if you've required these bits of alien technology, then obviously you'd have to have constructed a very substantial infrastructure to study it and exploit it, probably one that's a lot of money. And so, in other words, to get into the crash retrieval scenario really overturned a lot of previous ideas about what the cover-up really was all about. We get into the early 1980s, and here, now, you know, Linda always looks cool. It doesn't matter. I mean, this is Linda in 1980. Okay? Now, my daughter is 11 years old. My daughter is Elaine, and she's a pistol, I'll tell you. She's the fashion guru of our house. And my daughter has often said that the 1970s were the worst crime of fashion ever inflicted upon mankind. And Bill Moore is a case in point here. I mean, and that's not even in color, okay? And now over here is Paul Benowitz. Yeah, the 70s. Yeah, right, yeah, the Beatles. But things get very, very intense, all right, through the 80s. And again, this is yet another of those dreaded minefields that I wanted to weasel out as best I could, and I was unable to, so I had to deal with it. Damn it, I didn't want to, but I did, and again, you can read and decide for yourself how you feel it was handled. I mean, the bottom line, I will say this, the people who have read this section of my book have told me that they felt it was very even-handed, and that's really all that I tried to do. The bottom line is this, you have the story of Paul Benowitz, okay? The tragic story of this man. Paul Benowitz was a private defense scientist, very, very highly capable, intelligent, technically proficient, trained man, who was seeing what appeared to be UFOs over Kirtland Air Force Base and Manzano weapons facility, which is right directly across from where he worked and lived. And being Paul Benowitz, he had instrumentation to record these visually and other electronic means. And so he's getting worked up over it. And this gets the attention of Air Force Intelligence and the NSA. Probably majestic, right? And so what happens? Well, Paul Benowitz starts to unravel as the 1980s progress. But in the early period, I don't think he's unraveled at all. I was given some of his notes by Ron Regehr. Ron had copies of them. Ron was friends with Paul. I read through these notes. He had crystal clear, rock-solid handwriting, sharp, intelligent. He was recording something. My conclusion of that, and again, this is something you can read and decide if it's well-made. My conclusion is that he was seeing more than advanced but conventional technologies. I think he was seeing what we would call UFOs. That's what I believe he was seeing. Bill Moore becomes brought into the Air Force intelligence scene at this time, after his book on Roswell comes out. And Linda has her encounter in 1983 with Richard Doty. And with all of this, we have to ask ourselves, it comes down to the MJ-12 document. Linda meets with Richard, Linda Moulton Howe meets with Richard Doty 19 months before the MJ-12 documents are leaked. And she's shown a version that's very similar. Oh, God, you're kidding me. You are kidding me. I have 10 minutes, okay. I am the worst at doing this. There is none worse than me at timing these lectures. It's like the running joke of my professional life here. Here's what I want to say about MJ-12 then, very quickly. The argument is, are they true or false? I don't really think that's the way to look at it anymore. And that sounds like a sneaking out of the conclusion, but I really don't think that's the right way to look at it. I chatted with a researcher who is a friend of mine. He's not as well known in this field as I think he should be. He's a very, very intelligent man, Randy Kopang. He wrote a book on this topic called Camouflage Through Limited Disclosure. It's very interesting. We chat a lot, and I keep wondering, I'm now wondering a lot, is this a controlled management of the process of disclosure? You can leak something that's actually totally true, but if you don't give it a provenance, then what good is it really? Okay? I mean, the MJ-12 documents have shown a great deal of extremely relevant and useful data that's gotten out of them. To call them a hoax, as some people have done, just doesn't work. That's not the way to look at them. There's something else going on. But they've also have been released by inside sources. So the question is, are they sympathetic leaks with a genuine effort to end the truth embargo? Or is it a way to slowly manage a long-term process of disclosure in a way that's deniable, also while monitoring the reactions of the researchers themselves and the public? I think that's the kind of way we need to look at it. As the 1980s go on, I'm going to go through this because I want to hit my last section here. The internet explodes and affects ufology dramatically. It's as a result of that that we get more voices getting widespread attention. Bill Cooper, John Lear, who's not pictured here, Bob Lazar. On top there is the ARV. This is a story that derives from 1988. You can read about it in my book. The question is, were these people hoaxers, liars, truth tellers, whistleblowers, or managed by the intelligence community to be allowed to see certain things with the knowledge that they would then talk? I just submit that to you as an idea. I think the latter case is getting toward the truth. I will mention some quieter leaks, and particularly that of Dr. Eric Walker, pictured here at the bottom. Eric Walker is very important because the way that we got to him, the way that researchers got to him, I should say. I wasn't involved. We learned about Eric Walker because Canadian researcher Arthur Bray, years before, found handwritten notes, this is a little complex, but bear with me, by Wilbur Smith, Canadian scientist, who had talked about his meeting with Robert Sarbacher, defense scientist, in 1950. Okay, wow. Big thing. Sarbacher was talking about ET and aliens and all of this. Well, Sarbacher was alive. He was found in the 1980s, and he talks to researchers and confirms the whole scenario. And then Sarbacher leads researchers to Dr. Eric Walker. Walker's another big shot defense scientist. And what does he say? Yes, I know of MJ-12. You're delving into an area you can do nothing about. Leave it alone. Now that's not managed leaks or disinfo, not in my opinion. When you come to people in that way, and he talks the way he did, I think that's pretty darn good evidence that, you know, this is a case where researchers got lucky and hit a home run. The end of my book, the end of the chapter, the last one's called False Dawn. There's a lot there. Essentially, I think it's possible that there was an abortive attempt for a UFO disclosure in the Bush administration. I'm not saying it's definite, but I think it's possible. Military abductions start to become an issue. I believe they are valid. I believe they happen. You can read why. The New World Order and End of Nations. Thank you, Ryan. Happens during this period. You know, the New World Order is a phrase that the Rockefeller brothers were using as early as 1975. Who knows how much earlier than that? The first public mentioning of New World Order took place in 1990 in the Bush White House. Who's in control of our world? Is it the president or the guy who puts them there, i.e. David Rockefeller? In the period under review in this book, I think you can say every single U.S. president was placed into power because David Rockefeller nodded his head and said, yes, I want him. So, going along that line, my basic argument about the structure of secrecy is, I'm going to simplify it here for now. We retrieved exotic technologies that had to be kept secret at all costs. It required secret budgetary appropriations, i.e. UFOs are one of the key initiators of what we call the black budget. Black budget analysts don't take this into consideration. They completely blow it. UFO phenomenon is critically important in the origin of our black budget world. And what happens then, I argue, is privatization of the secret. A very good article by this man, Bill Sweetman, about a decade ago. There aren't that many public articles on special access programs. This is one. It's getting a little dated, but I think it's a good analysis. At that time, he estimated there were about 150 of them. There were probably a little bit fewer in 1990 and probably a lot more today. The key thing that Sweetman argued is that his study showed they appear to be dominated by the private contractors, not by the DoD personnel. And he had no idea how they got all their money. To take it to the UFO angle, I think this takes place in the late 90s. This is the story of Thomas Wilson, head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs at the time, interviewed by Edgar Mitchell, astronaut, and Dr. Stephen Greer. And yes, Thomas Wilson did discuss deep black programs to study alien technology. I've gotten this from a number of sources. I spoke to Wilson myself. I've discussed this at times. He got really mad at me and hung up the phone. But yes. And he was denied access. even though he was head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs. I absolutely believe that's the case. He's denied it. I can understand, okay? So what we have is not a classified problem, but a proprietary one. I've said this many times before. You have private, wealthy entities that have hijacked government agencies for their own profit. Special access programs are one of their tools. Now, there's a concept that I've tossed out there in this book. I think it's worth pursuing, the idea of a breakaway civilization. Very quickly, if you go through the history of human civilization, you know that we've had many different civilizations, often simultaneously existing. You go back 500 years, you got China and Europe and Africa and Middle East and so on, South America, separate, different understandings of science, different cosmologies, different ways of how they looked at the world, yet, okay, they were still independent. During the Cold War, we had something of that with Soviet and Western science. They didn't share all their data at all when they couldn't. So we have different infrastructures. There's nothing against this happening now. And if you look at the black world with immense funding, total secrecy, and the head start of analyzing certain amounts of alien technology, it's really not hard, is it, to see that one breakthrough would lead to another, to another, to another, to another. The next thing you know, they're in a different place than we are. Now, some of those breakthroughs would lead to making money, right? Money-making opportunities. But would all of them? Would all of them be shared with the outside world? Maybe not. When the U.S. bombed Libya in 1986, the U.S. did not use its top fighter aircraft at the time, which was the stealth fighter. I'm waiting for Ryan to pop his head out there. I know it's going to happen. The stealth fighter was not used because its secrecy was considered too important to blow, even on the Libya operation. In other words, we will have technologies that we reserve, okay? So if you've got technology to deal with the UFO phenomenon, that is, let's say, your own flying saucers, it is very conceivable, as I see it, that you would withhold them in your ordinary geopolitical wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though they would come in mighty handy, wouldn't they? And even though without using them, you might bankrupt your country. And yet something else would be considered so important that you have to reserve that technology only for that. And what would that other thing be? Well, clearly, dealing with them would be considered that important. So summarizing my book, and then I'm going to try to get 5 more minutes to talk about the future. My book deals with an era of major transition, non-stop encounters with UFOs by global militaries. That alone is enough for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times to cover it. New perceptions by researchers. Ufology became repoliticized. Exposure of UFO secrets occurs throughout. That's why it's the cover-up exposed, although not the cover-up overturned. Counter initiatives by the intelligence community and a global transformation. Now we'll look ahead real fast. I've talked about this a number of times. This isn't completely new, although I've got a couple of new ideas here. I believe that the end of this secrecy is going to come. Look, we don't live in a static world, quite the opposite. We live in a world of unbelievable transformation. And in that situation, we just cannot expect that things will stay the same. How can they? We've all lived through the internet of the last 20 years, which has completely changed our world, and that can't be expected to stop. We're not living in normal times. Something will be a trigger to break this open. Now, what that trigger is, I don't know. But there's going to be a lot of difficult issues to deal with. Any disclosure will have to deal with why have we been confronting them all these years? Why are our jets chasing those objects? How, Mr. President, have you been able to keep this secret from us all these years? Well, getting into that's going to be a very messy business. It's going to get into, to some extent, the nature of the illegal structure of our society, the black budget, the fact that it's completely trashed the U.S. Constitution, the fact that huge amounts of money have gotten siphoned away from you and me, and much, much more. What are these secret programs about, sir? Are we going off-world, as many have leaked and claimed and alleged? Do you have massive underground bases where this is being studied, as many have alleged? Have you replicated their technology, as many have alleged? won't be easy to dodge these. Then there's the question of who these other intelligences are, these other beings. That's going to be very difficult to deal with. Why are they interested in us? I'm going to deal with that in a minute. And the challenge to our infrastructure. Let me go to that right now. I'll take one example, energy. These objects are flying on something other than petroleum. I think that's a safe bet. Whatever they're using, 1 minute, 1 minute. Whatever they are using is going to be something better than that. We can call it free energy. I don't know what it is. There's different theories. The fact is it's going to end our petroleum-based economy very rapidly, and that's going to result in a very significant disruption. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's going to be 10 really bitchy years, and it won't be fun. It'll be very difficult. It'll be very disruptive. When we get to the end of it, it could be a great place, or not. Why have they been interested in us all these years? There's evidence to show that they've been interested in a long, long time in us. I'll bypass that for the moment. Why are they interested in us now? Because we are by far the most interesting thing going on in this whole section of the galaxy right now. How could we not be? Seriously. Look at what we have done in 100 years, okay? And what we're going to be doing in another 50. As I say in my book, and as I say here, we are about to leap into their world. We are literally jumping in there. Well, not literally. We are figuratively jumping into their world. We're going to have our eyes and ears open. They know this. They cannot not know this if they're watching us. I'm just about finished here. We are at a crossroads in our civilization, in our crossroads as a species. Here's a couple of the questions. Are we going to move toward global fascism or freedom? The battleground, well, is the internet. The battleground is in your community. Are we going to live a world of truth or fantasies? A world in which we actually know what's going on around us, or in which we all zone out to whatever entertainment's on the internet, or on TV, or virtual reality, or gaming. It's not hard to foresee a reality in the future where people completely vegged out, living some kind of brave new world. But we can also have a different possibility here. Then you've got the infrastructure issue. Our infrastructure, petroleum-based water, our freshwater infrastructure, all of these are tenuous. And they are in danger of collapse. Ecosystem. How long can we really expect that things are going to go as they are? Now, there is probably some type of an answer in this UFO phenomenon. And we need to know what that answer is. Now, here's the challenge. On Friday, I was asked on the panel, what would I do as president if I were to deal with this? And I want to talk a little bit about it. What do we need? We need a reasoned humanitarian response by responsible leaders to bring about a peaceful transition and a courageous confrontation of the truth. To wit, this is my final slide here. If I were a president, really? Or if some person as president were to do the right thing, this might be a place to start. Reclaim full constitutional authority in the name of the people of the United States over runaway black budget operations. Now, how you do that? Okay, but it's what has to be done. If you want to look at the strategy, this is what has to be done. You must enforce authority over runaway privatized black budget operations. And you must enlist Congress and the people behind you. Release individuals from their black world ET-related secrets. Yes. Establish open international collaboration on the full range of all of these issues. Political, sociological, economic, cultural, religious, whatever. You have to pay special attention to the problems of transitioning human society away from a petroleum-based global economy. That's a big, big problem. Promote a federalized global government. It's not a corporate-dominated New World Order. I think some people might have misinterpreted what I said on Friday. I was not saying that at all. It's certainly what I don't want. A global Bill of Rights. I think the best example of what we could try for in our future is a larger version of what the American constitutional experiment was 200 years ago. You have a federalized system with individual rights among people and regional rights. That's collaborative. But there's going to be need for some kind of, because what we have right now is a bunch of corporate animals that are running around without a leash. Okay? What we've developed is a global system, okay, that has outgrown the old structure that's supposed to manage it. And what we have to have is a true correction. We have to have publicly based control over a globalized system of some sort, in which the corporate control over policies is taken out. Yes, clap for that. It's necessary. And then finally, what we have to have is an encouragement of a global culture that will allow us to meet the ET challenge. We don't have a culture that does that right now, and we need to get there. In short, what we need is a hero or many heroes. That's really what we need. And I thank you very much. This is my website.
All right.
Visit it. Write to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
You're a hero.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, that was